If you had told anyone watching the first chaotic hours of Russia's full-scale invasion that Ukraine would still be fighting more than 4 years later, hardly anyone would have believed you. But here we are. Not only is Ukraine still standing, as of early March 2026, but it is, by most measurable indicators, in a stronger operational position than it was in 2025. There are a few different reasons for this, all centering on the fact that Ukraine has been able to develop more effective weapons and tactics over the course of the war, while Russia remained firmly entrenched in the old ways. In fact, there's been such an exchange of fortunes that not only has Ukraine broken through Russia's front line, but Russia doesn't seem to be able to prevent its advance. The key for Ukraine? Hitting them where it really hurts. Let's start with the broader framing offered by Bill Browder, the financier and anti-corruption campaigner who has become one of the sharpest voices on the economic dimensions of Russia's war. His argument is twofold. On one side, Russia has made huge tactical mistakes, which we've covered extensively over the course of the 4 years of war. But the other argument is that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is done waiting for Western governments to impose economic pressure on Russia. Instead, Ukraine is doing it directly. With strikes on Russian oil refineries and attacks on the so-called shadow fleet vessels that Moscow uses to circumvent sanctions, Ukraine has managed to strike Russia where it hurts most, right in the wallet. Every refinery taken offline, every tanker disabled, is a blow to the revenue stream sustaining Russia's war machine. Let's look at the numbers. According to the Carnegie Endowment, Ukraine knocked out around 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity. However, that same analysis suggests that Russia only realistically lost about 6 to 9% of its net fuel export capabilities, due to having a cushion of excess production. This was done over the course of 120 attacks throughout 2025, most of which managed to inflict some damage on Russian oil infrastructure. The attacks culminated in 2026 with 40 strikes over the course of January and February, hitting at least 13 vital targets. This included an attack on the Volgograd oil refinery, shutting down 40% of its production capacity. This facility alone accounted for roughly 5% of pre-war fuel exports, essentially allowing Ukraine to further its goal of cutting Russia off from the resources sustaining its efforts. This has all been in no small part due to Ukraine's ability to reach new targets, a capability that has expanded dramatically since the early months of the war. Then, it was entirely dependent on whatever range limitations Western-supplied weapons happened to carry. In 2025 and 2026, that expansion is epitomized by Firepoint. The Kyiv-based private defense company, founded in mid-2022 by a group of engineers, architects, and game designers, started in makeshift workshops and has grown to over 2,000 employees operating across multiple concealed production facilities in and around Kyiv. In particular, the FP-1 drone deserves a moment of special attention. The one-way attack, OWA drone, is the workhorse that has been doing the most damage. With a range of roughly 620 miles, a warhead of over 60 pounds, depending on configuration, and a design optimized for modularity, ease of assembly, and electronic warfare resilience, the FP-1 has been credited with conducting more than 60% of Ukrainian deep strikes inside Russian territory. That means the majority of the strikes on Russian ammunition depots, oil refineries, and military command centers that have made international headlines over the past year were delivered by this single domestically produced platform. The FP-2 was the next step up. It's a heavier hitter with a larger payload but smaller range, designed for targeting hardened structures. The smaller range of only 130 miles means that the drone was meant to destroy command centers or stop Russians from advancing into Ukraine's territory. But in early 2026, Firepoint's co-founder and chief designer, Dennis Schlitterman, suggested that the platform was supposed to undergo an update to accommodate a 98-pound warhead to increase its effectiveness. Above the FP-1 and FP-2 in capability sits the FP-5 Flamingo. This is Firepoint's cruise missile, which carries a 2,540-pound warhead over a range of up to 1,900 miles. Its airframe is constructed using radar-transparent fiberglass winding, a technique normally reserved for ballistic missiles, which helps it evade radar detection during flight. Production began ramping up in mid-2025, targeting 210 units per month by autumn. More importantly, the Flamingo has already been used, with Ukrainian sources confirming strikes on Russia's Kapustin Yar test range in January 2026. In a separate operation, the missile struck an Iskander missile production plant inside Russia. This is a cruise missile, built in Ukraine, hitting the factories that make the missiles Russia fires at Ukrainian cities. Which brings us to the pinnacle of Firepoint's ambition, the FP9. This is a short-range ballistic missile with a range of around 500 miles, a warhead of 1,700 pounds, and a terminal velocity of roughly Mach 6.5. For comparison, Russia's Iskander ballistic missile, the system that has caused enormous damage to Ukrainian infrastructure throughout the war, hits its target at roughly a third of that speed. In practice, that means air defense systems have a fraction of the intercept window they would normally have against an Iskander. And given how Russia has been slowly bleeding S-400s throughout the war, a widespread deployment of FP9s could accelerate Ukraine's economic sanctioning by missile. Throughout all this, arguably the most important factor is that the entire weapons program exists completely separately from NATO and Western constraints. The ATACMS missiles provided by the United States have a maximum range of approximately 190 miles, essentially capped to prevent strikes deep inside Russia. So everything that has reached Moscow or targeted infrastructure in Russia's interior has been domestically produced. If the FP9 reaches widespread production, it could threaten Moscow or St. Petersburg. Beyond the weapons themselves, Ukraine has also started to address a systemic problem that has reduced the effectiveness of its drone campaign since the start of the war. On March 10th, Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, who was appointed to the role in January 2026, specifically to accelerate Ukraine's technological edge, signed a formal order restructuring how the country buys drones. The old system was based on relationships, opaque demand formation processes, and factors that military analysts have described plainly as corruption risks. The result was that Ukrainian frontline soldiers regularly received drones that didn't perform as advertised, which they then had to modify and repair by hand in the trenches. The new system is much more straightforward. Military units submit requests based on their needs. The General Staff then compiles a procurement list containing only the technical specifications of the equipment required. Crucially, the list has no brand names and no specific manufacturers listed. The question of which products actually get purchased is then decided by 5 digital battlefield data systems: E-Points, which tracks the real combat effectiveness of equipment in the field; DOT Chain and Brave One Market, which record what units are purchasing independently, reflecting actual demand at the ground level; and Delta and Mission Control, which provide synchronization matrices and combat application analytics. If a drone doesn't fly or doesn't hit targets, the system simply removes all demand for it. The procurement decision is made by data, not by whoever has the right relationship with the ministry. The budget allocation is also changed. Under the new structure, 80% of procurement funds go exclusively to systems that have demonstrated effectiveness through battlefield data. The remaining 20% is reserved for innovation, such as new systems being tested under combat conditions, all without requiring the full bureaucracy that exists in the Western system. Fedorov described this 20% as the mechanism for rapid testing of new technologies without unnecessary bureaucracy. In practice, it means Ukraine can test a new drone design at scale within weeks of it appearing, rather than waiting months for the certification process to clear. Then there's the scale of Ukraine's defense industry, which has been practically transformed. At the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine had 7 drone manufacturers. It now has more than 500. Electronic warfare companies have grown from 2 to more than 200. Private missile manufacturers did not exist. There are now more than 20. Unmanned ground vehicle companies went from 0 to more than 100. This scale of growth is something that hasn't been seen in the 21st century and has allowed Ukraine to stay on track with Russia in terms of drone innovation. On the electronic battlefield, Ukraine has also made strides in trying to curb Russia's numerical advantage, especially regarding drones. Enter the laser weapons. Footage shared through Russian telegram channels, which is itself telling, appeared to show a Ukrainian-directed energy weapon disabling a fiber-optic-guided FPV drone. The drone in question is what soldiers on both sides call a waiter, or an ambush drone that lands beside a road in low-power mode, waits for an enemy vehicle, then activates and strikes. Fiber-optic waiters are controlled via a physical cable that spools out from the drone as it flies. Because they don't use radio signals, they are effectively immune to electronic jamming. This is precisely why they have become one of the more dangerous threats on the front line. Of course, Ukraine has its own version of the fiber-optic drone with similar results, but it can be argued that Russia made the advancement first and has been using it effectively to deny Ukraine the opportunity to place its troops near the front line. But the new energy weapon might turn that advantage on its head. The footage shows a concentrated beam of light tracking along the fiber-optic cable linking the drone to its operator, after which the drone loses control and shuts down. This is most likely the hypothesized Sunray laser system, a prototype demonstrated to the Atlantic in February, described as car trunk-sized and capable of burning small drones out of the sky within seconds. Serhiy Bezkresnov, a Ministry of Defense advisor and military radio technology specialist, responded to Russian claims that the footage is real with characteristic sarcasm. Russians say we have found a way to counter fiber optics. With this thing, we also scan brains and abduct people, Bezkresnov stated. But the Russian drone operators caught on video did not appear to find it funny. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery told reporters shortly before this footage emerged that Ukraine could field battlefield lasers within 1 to 2 years. Compare this to the average procurement time, ranging from 6 years and up, with America's own anti-drone laser systems being in active development since 2022. It's evident that as the counter-drone race accelerates, with drones becoming the de facto replacements for traditional human troops on the battlefield, the first nation to make an effective, low-cost weapon could have an enormous advantage. And that's precisely why the prospect of a laser weapon is so unique. Being powered by electricity, the cost per engagement of the proposed weapon would be significantly lower than the cost to create the offending drone. This is counter to the existing economics of drone warfare, where a relatively expensive missile or drone is used to intercept less costly enemy drones, which could essentially turn the very concept of drones on its head. But Ukraine has used this momentum to its full effect. On the ground, the battlefield picture across February 2026 suggests that Ukraine is, at least by the Institute for the Study of War's own assessment, in a better position than at the start of 2026. If you want to learn exactly how this happened, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show. We post daily content that closely follows everything related to the war. In short, Russia failed to accomplish much of its actual goals for the winter season. Russian troops began advancing relatively quickly on the Hulyaipole and Oleksandrivka axes in late October and early November 2025. Russian command likely hoped that these advances would complement operations near Kyiv, allowing Russian forces to approach the city from both east and west and eventually move toward Zaporizhia. This maneuver could have allowed Russian troops to bypass Ukraine's heavily fortified east-west defensive lines in Zaporizhia Oblast instead of attempting frontal assaults from the south. Remember, Zaporizhia was basically one of the last bastions of Ukraine's resistance in the region, especially after Russia managed to claim a Pyrrhic victory in Pokrovsk after 2 years of combat there. The plan had a certain logic to it. In early December 2025, ISW assessed that a tactical breakthrough north and northeast of Hulyaipole could allow Russian forces to achieve operational gains. Then on December 29, 2025, the Russian command announced plans to link the Kyiv and Hulyaipole axes in order to advance toward Zaporizhia. Beyond that, the ultimate objective seemed to be Ukraine's fortress belt, which is the heavily fortified corridor of cities in Donetsk Oblast, including Drushkivka, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk, where Russia has been positioning to assault as the centerpiece of its spring-summer 2026 campaign. But this is where things started going wrong. You see, Russia's winter 2025-2026 missile and drone campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure failed to achieve any of its intended strategic objectives. Despite causing significant damage to Ukraine's power grid and months of hardship for civilians, Russian forces failed to sever the energy network near the front, and their strikes couldn't prevent Ukraine's defense industrial base from growing in the region. Ukrainian Defense Ministry advisor Hanna Gvozdyar stated on February 19th that it had increased production 50-fold since 2022 and reached an estimated $50 billion worth of output. Russia targeted the infrastructure meant to stop Ukrainian weapons production, and yet the weapons production grew anyway. On the ground, Russia's tactics were similarly hampered. Moscow bet on infiltration tactics and offensive actions with light motorized forces, which ideally means it loses less armored equipment but very many people. But by late December 2025, there was already a slowdown because Russian forces had taken very heavy losses over the preceding months. The infiltration model worked when Russian infantry successfully penetrated Ukrainian positions, accumulated, and consolidated. But Ukrainian forces prevented the infiltrating squads from getting a follow-up advance from the rest of the Russian troops, essentially cutting them off in the middle of enemy territory. This has likely deprived Russian forces of the starting offensive positions from which they intended to launch a summer offensive with the goal of reaching Zaporizhia. Then, Ukraine's counteroffensive launched in late January exploited exactly that failure. Ukrainian forces started pushing Russian forces out of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and undermining Russian preparations for a spring offensive. The sudden shift in the front line has meant Ukraine liberated over 150 square miles of territory in less than a month, returning more territory to Ukraine than it lost in mid to late summer for the first time since the summer 2023 counteroffensive. The specific units being moved tell the story of how stretched Russia actually is. The Russian military command was forced to redeploy elite airborne and naval infantry units from the Pokrovsk direction and the Dobropilya tactical area in eastern Ukraine to the southern front line, likely to respond to those same Ukrainian gains. These were basically forces that only barely managed to occupy Pokrovsk just months earlier and have taken heavy casualties as well. For example, ISW had not observed the 656th Motorized Rifle Regiment operating on the battlefield since August 2025. This suggested the Russian military command had previously withdrawn this unit and may have been holding it in reserve for future offensive operations. Essentially, Russia is forced to spend its spring offensive reserve on defense months ahead of schedule. The fact that a series of Ukrainian tactical counterattacks is forcing Russia to make operational and strategic decisions suggests Russian forces are already overstretched even while preparing for a major offensive. As a result, the Kremlin could be forced to either abandon its plans for a spring-summer 2026 offensive or significantly adjust them in Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast, or both. But Russia's problem is not simply the casualties. The entire structure behind Russia's war machine is on unstable legs and close to collapsing. Take, for example, the recruitment numbers. Around 422,000 people signed contracts with the Russian military in 2025, which is a 6% drop from the approximately 450,000 who signed in 2024, according to Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia. Some Russian regions are reported to have cut the size of their military sign-up bonuses due to economic strain. Remember, this is the same military that started the war with roughly 160,000 troops deployed to Ukraine, then committed nearly 900,000 soldiers to the conflict. And according to the most recent estimates, Russia had lost over 1.25 million troops in the war, essentially going through its entire pre-war reserve and then another half of it. More specifically, the peak seems to have occurred in December 2025, when Russian losses for the first time exceeded the number of newly recruited contract soldiers. Russia added 27,400 contract soldiers that month, while its losses reached 33,200 killed and wounded. In previous months, conscription numbers were still relatively favorable for the Kremlin, but this slowdown complicates things greatly. One analysis suggested that Russia actually needs around 45,000 monthly recruits to have any hope of mounting a serious offensive during 2026. Considering that it's barely reaching two-thirds of that number, it's fair to say that Russia has essentially lost most of its tempo, despite still maintaining a healthy numerical advantage overall. The Kremlin's response has followed a predictable pattern of expanding the recruitment pool downward. Russia has systematically expanded so-called special contingents used to replenish the army. In 2025, the category was broadened to include not only prisoners and people under criminal investigation, but also individuals with unpaid financial debts, including outstanding loans. Russia has also increased the recruitment of foreign citizens, particularly from countries it considers friendly, including states in Africa and South America, with potential recruits lured or even deceived with promises of financial rewards or citizenship. This all points to one thing only, that Russia is slowly being drained of its resources. On the economic front, Ukraine has slowly managed to exert its own form of sanctions by destroying parts of Russia's oil refining and export infrastructure. The West has also created more pressure by being more vigilant over shadow fleet ships moving in and out of the Baltic Sea. On the weapon front, Russia has arguably lost the advantage it had through the cheap-to-manufacture Shaheds. Ukraine's domestic long-range drones have a similar procurement cost, but it's not tied to another country. Remember, with the US and Israel in renewed conflict with Iran, Russia is basically forced to concede some of its imported weaponry from the Middle East. Even worse, Russia has basically acknowledged that it can no longer influence the region when it pulled out of Syria in late 2024, after quick opposition offensives that mirror what Ukraine is trying to do in Donbass. And on the tactics front, Russia has spent far too much time, effort, and soldiers failing to capture two vital cities in the region, Pokrovsk and Zaporizhia. While Pokrovsk eventually fell, it did so only after Russia reportedly lost over 25,000 soldiers in the area, roughly 20% of the total casualties. All of this culminates in one thing. When Ukraine starts making another push back into Donbass, Russia might actually be forced to admit that it can't stop it anymore. But all of the battlefield reports actually come second. The real behind the scenes of the war are happening in Moscow itself. To learn more about how Russian President Vladimir Putin is slowly losing control over the country, check out this video. And if you want to stay up to date with the most recent news in global military and geopolitics, make sure to subscribe.